What would you do if the only thing you inherited from a life of hardship was a key? A single, rust-pocked iron key to a place everyone in the world told you was worthless. For 20-year-old Jane Holloway, arriving in the damp Yorkshire village of Oakhaven in the autumn of 1852, this was not a question but her reality. Her mother had left her a locked barn and the debt of a name everyone had forgotten how to respect, for the laughable price of all the love she had in the world. But the truth waiting inside that crumbling stone was a secret kept for 2 generations, a truth that would not only save her from the coming winter, but restore a legacy the world had tried to erase. So settle in, find a comfortable chair, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight as we tell this story of quiet defiance. Jane Holloway stepped down from the carter's wagon, her worn boots sinking into the thick, cloying mud of the village lane. The air smelled of wet earth, coal smoke, and the coming frost. Around her, the stone cottages of Oakhaven seemed to huddle together, their windows like wary eyes watching her slow, solitary progress. She carried a small canvas satchel containing all she owned, a change of linen, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and the heavy iron key her mother had pressed into her palm a week before, her own hand as cold as the metal. "It's all I have left for you, Jane," she had whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Don't let them take it." Her mother was gone now, laid to rest in a pauper's grave in the city, far from the green hills she had spoken of with such a deep and hollow ache. Jane had used the last of their money to pay the carter to bring her here, back to the place her family had been tenants for 100 years, or so the story went. She had not been here since she was a girl, before her father's death had sent them away in search of work that never quite paid enough to live. The memories were frayed, images of sunlight on a stone wall, the smell of hay, the rough bark of an old oak. She clutched the key in her pocket, its teeth biting into her cold fingers. It was her only anchor in this sea of veiled glances and closed doors. As she passed the public house, a curtain twitched. A moment later, 2 men stepped out, their faces ruddy from ale. One of them, a stout man with a proprietary air she would later learn, was the squire. Mr. Silas Croft looked her up and down. "Holloway," he said, the name an accusation. "Thought we were rid of your lot." Jane said nothing, merely lowered her gaze and kept walking, her worn gray dress clinging to her thin frame. His laughter followed her down the lane, loud and contemptuous. It was the sound of a man who believed he owned the very ground she walked on. Her only kindness came from the carter, a man named Fletcher, who had known her father. Before he left, he pointed down a path that branched off from the main village road, little more than 2 muddy ruts disappearing between overgrown hedgerows. "It's down there," he said, his voice low and gruff with an unspoken pity. "The old Holloway plot. Barns still standing, I suppose." He hesitated, then pushed a small cloth-wrapped parcel into her hands, a bit of cheese, for the journey's end. Jane could only nod, the lump in her throat too thick for words. She watched his cart rattle away until it was just a sound, leaving her utterly alone. The path was dark under the canopy of hawthorn and ash, and as she walked, the village sounds faded behind her, replaced by the drip of water from leaf to leaf and the sad cry of a distant crow. Then the lane opened up, and she saw it, set on a small rise against a sky, the color of slate. The barn stood like a great gray animal that had laid down to die. The roof sagged in the middle, a spine broken by years of neglect. The great wooden doors were gray and splintered, one hanging crookedly from a single hinge. Patches of the stone wall had crumbled, leaving dark, gaping wounds. It was worse, so much worse, than her faint childhood memories had allowed. A profound and chilling disappointment settled over her. This was it. This was all that was left. A ruin. She walked slowly towards it, the wet grass sighing around her ankles, the cold iron key in her hand feeling less like a promise and more like the final, bitter jest of a cruel fate. The wind picked up, moaning through the broken slats of the wall, a sound of utter desolation. Jane stood before the great weathered doors of the barn, her small form dwarfed by their decaying mass. The wood was silvered with age and patched with dark green moss. One door was barred shut from the inside, but the other, the one her mother's key was for, was held by a huge, plate-sized lock, its iron face a mask of orange rust. For a moment she simply stared at it, the final barrier between her and the inheritance that felt more and more like a curse. Her loyal companion, an old, three-legged black cat named Soot, she'd carried in a basket, mewed softly at her feet, rubbing against her leg, as if to offer what little courage he possessed. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, Jane pushed the key into the lock. It grated, refusing to turn. She put her shoulder into it, her whole body straining against a century of rust and disuse. With a groan of protesting metal that seemed to echo across the silent field, the mechanism finally gave way. The lock clicked open with a sound like a breaking bone. She pulled the door, its bottom edge scraping a deep arc in the packed earth beneath. It opened into a cavern of shadows and musty air. The smell that rolled out was thick with decay, the scent of damp straw, rotted timber, and the ghosts of animals long gone. Light struggled to pierce the gloom, illuminating a world of dust. Thick cobwebs, heavy as shrouds, hung from every beam. The floor was a deep mattress of ancient blackened straw, littered with the debris of a hasty departure. A broken rake, a rusted scythe head, the splintered remains of a wooden pail. High above, the sagging roof showed slivers of the gray sky. It was a place of profound and absolute emptiness. All the hope she had guarded on the long journey here, a tiny, flickering flame, seemed to gutter and die in that cold, stale air. This was not a shelter. It was a tomb, a monument to her family's failure. Tears she had refused to shed for her mother's passing now burned at the back of her eyes. She had been a fool to come, a fool to believe a simple key could unlock anything other than more hardship. She sank down onto a low stone ledge just inside the doorway, the rough canvas of her satchel on her lap, and buried her face in her hands. Soot, ever practical, began to explore this new territory, his single back leg giving his gait a determined, rolling rhythm. He sniffed at the piles of straw, his whiskers twitching, seemingly unbothered by the oppressive gloom. Jane stayed there for a long time, listening to the silence, which was not truly silent at all. It was filled with the tiny scuttling of unseen things, the drip of water from the broken roof, and the mournful sigh of the wind. That evening, she did not have the heart to sleep inside the barn itself. A few yards away stood a tiny, one-room shepherd's bothy, its roof mostly intact, but its door long gone. Using a piece of a fallen fence, she managed to block the opening against the wind. She unrolled her thin blanket on the cold earth floor, sharing her last piece of bread and the carter's cheese with Soot. Through the gaps in her makeshift door, she could see the silhouette of the barn against the darkening sky. It looked immense, a silent, brooding presence that held the weight of her family's past and her own bleak future. She fell into a fitful sleep, the iron key clutched in her hand, dreaming of locked doors that opened into nothing. Was this all there was? A pile of stone and rotting wood? What secret could possibly be worth guarding in a place so clearly abandoned to time? And what of the squire's claim that her family owed him a debt? Perhaps the key was not a gift, but a burden meant to trap her here. We'd love to hear your first impressions in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for the rest of Jane's incredible story. For now, she had only the cold comfort of a stone floor and the questions that haunted the darkness around her. The next morning, Jane awoke stiff and cold, a sliver of pale dawn light cutting across the dirt floor of the bothy. The air was sharp with the promise of a hard frost. She knew she could not stay in the tiny hut forever. It was barely a shelter. With a sense of grim resolve, she forced herself to her feet, brushed the dirt from her dress, and faced the barn once more. If this was to be her life, she would not be defeated by it on the second day. She needed supplies, a candle, matches, perhaps some oats if she could afford them. The village was a necessity she could not avoid. Squaring her shoulders, she made her way back down the muddy track. As she entered the small market square, a hush fell. The women gathered around the pump stopped their chatter, their eyes following her. The blacksmith, his hammer arrested mid-swing, watched her from the smoky darkness of his forge. She felt their collective gaze like a physical weight. It was the gaze reserved for outsiders, for paupers, for those who did not belong. At a small stall selling household goods, she used a few of her precious pennies to buy a tallow candle and a box of lucifers. The shopkeeper's wife took the coins without a word, her expression a mixture of pity and disapproval. As Jane turned to leave, a loud voice boomed across the square. "Well, well, the prodigal daughter returns to claim her kingdom of ruins." Mr. Silas Croft stood on the steps of the modest building that served as his estate, office, his hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his thick lips. A few of the villagers snickered, emboldened by his confidence. Jane froze, her knuckles white where she gripped her small purchases. "I trust you've seen the state of that wreck," Croft continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "An eyesore, a blight on my land." "It was my mother's," Jane said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear in the sudden quiet. Croft laughed, a short, barking sound. "Your mother was a tenant, as was her father and his before him. Tenants who, I might add, fell grievously behind on their rents. That barn and the worthless patch of dirt it sits on reverts to me. I've been patient, but my patience has its limits. I want the place cleared. I'll be tearing it down before winter." He looked her over, his gaze lingering on her worn dress and pale face. "You have 1 week to remove any personal effects. After that, I'll have my men burn what's left." He turned and went back into his office, slamming the door behind him. The show was over. The villagers slowly returned to their business, but the whispers followed Jane as she fled the square. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. A debt? Her mother had never spoken of a debt, only of the barn, the key. Had she been sent here on a fool's errand, only to be publicly humiliated and cast out? Blindly, she hurried back towards the path, her one desire to escape the suffocating judgment of the village. As she reached the turnoff, a figure emerged from the shadow of a great yew tree by the churchyard wall. It was a woman, ancient and stooped, her face a roadmap of wrinkles. She was wrapped in a thick woolen shawl and leaned heavily on a staff of polished holly. Jane recognized her from vague childhood memory as old Elspeth, a woman who lived alone on the edge of the moors, and was said to have the second sight. Elspeth's eyes, cloudy with age but sharp with intelligence, fixed on Jane's face. She reached out a gnarled hand and gently touched Jane's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Don't you mind him?" the old woman said, her voice dry and rustling like autumn leaves. "He's a man who measures worth in coin and stone. He knows nothing of the true accounting." Jane stared at her, unsure what to say. Elspeth's gaze drifted past her, towards the path leading to the barn. She seemed to be looking at something only she could see. Then her eyes returned to Jane. "Some roots go deeper than stone," she said, her voice low and weighted with meaning. "Remember that, child." And with that she turned and shuffled away, disappearing back into the shadows of the churchyard, leaving Jane standing alone with the cryptic words echoing in her mind. Deeper than stone. What could she possibly have meant? Jane returned to the barn with old Elspeth's words turning over and over in her mind. Deeper than stone. It was a riddle without an answer, but it had planted a seed of defiance in her. Mr. Croft's threats, his public mockery, had been meant to break her, to make her flee. Instead, they had hardened her resolve. This barn was the last link to her mother, to her family. She would not abandon it without a fight, even if it was a fight she was destined to lose. With newfound purpose, she began the immense task of making the place habitable. Her first priority was light and air. The large wooden shutters over the two high windows were nailed shut. Using the broken head of the scythe as a makeshift crowbar, she worked at the boards, her muscles straining, until with a screech of rusty nails the first shutter gave way. It swung open, crashing against the outer stone wall. A broad shaft of pale afternoon light sliced through the gloom, illuminating a swirling universe of dust motes. For the first time she could see the true scale of the interior. The space was vast, larger than she had realized. The great oak beams soaring into the darkness of the rafters, like the skeleton of a beached whale. She forced the second shutter open, and the barn was filled with a soft gray light that pushed back the deepest of the shadows. Now she could see the work that lay ahead. She started in one corner, the one furthest from the leaking roof. Using a stiff besom she fashioned from a bundle of twigs, she began to sweep away the thick carpet of rotten straw. The work was slow and exhausting. The dust was so thick it choked her, coating her hair and clothes in a fine gray powder. Beneath the straw was a floor of packed earth and large, irregular flagstones, slick with a film of damp grime. As she worked, soot padded silently around her, his three-legged gait steady and unhurried. He seemed entirely at home in the cavernous space. He watched her for a time, then settled himself in a corner near the north wall, tucking his paws beneath him and beginning to purr, a low, rumbling sound that was a comfort in the oppressive silence. Jane cleared a small area, sweeping the stone clean. This would be her living space. She moved her satchel and blanket from the bothy, laying them out on the cold, clean stone. It was a pathetic little island of order in a sea of chaos, but it was hers. That night she slept inside the barn for the first time. She lit her single tallow candle, its small flame casting huge dancing shadows up the stone walls. She sat with her back against the wall, her blanket wrapped tightly around her, and ate the last of her bread. The wind had picked up again, and it whistled and moaned through the 1,000 cracks and holes in the building's ancient structure. The barn was alive with sound. It groaned and creaked like a great ship at sea. At times she could hear the skittering of rats in the rafters and the frantic fluttering of a bird that had become trapped inside. It should have been terrifying, but strangely it wasn't. Huddled in her small circle of light, with the steady weight of soot sleeping on her feet, she felt a peculiar sense of belonging. This place, for all its decay, felt more like a home than any of the cold city rooms she and her mother had rented over the years. She was not a guest here. She was the last of its line. Lying down on the hard floor, she listened to the barn's nocturnal symphony until she finally drifted off to sleep, the iron key now resting on the stone beside her head. Days blurred into a routine of relentless labor. Jane rose with the first light, her body aching from the cold and the unaccustomed work, and began the slow, methodical process of clearing the barn. She worked in sections, sweeping away the foul-smelling debris, piling the salvageable timber, and carrying the heaps of rotten straw outside to dry in the weak autumn sun. She discovered a small well just behind the barn, its water clear and ice-cold. It was a small miracle, saving her the daily walk to the village pump and the gauntlet of prying eyes. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the barn and the small patch of land around it. It was during this slow, repetitive work that she began to notice things, small details that seemed out of place. The barn was not one single structure, but two. The southern half, with its crumbling mortar and rough-hewn fieldstones, was clearly ancient. But the north wall, the one where she had made her small camp, was different. The stonework was finer, the blocks more regular and expertly fitted. The mortar was paler, harder. It was a newer addition, though still centuries old. Someone had not just built a barn here. They had expanded it, improved it, with considerable care and expense. This was not the work of a transient tenant, but of someone who intended to stay. Her cat, Soot, seemed drawn to this newer section. He rarely strayed from the corner against the north wall, often sleeping for hours in the exact same spot. Jane had swept the flagstones there clean on her first day, but now she looked at them more closely. Most were rough, pitted slate, but one, the very stone Soot seemed to favor, was different. It was a smoother, denser slab of granite, its surface worn almost glassy in the center, and it did not sit quite flush with its neighbors. There was a gap along one edge, no wider than a knife blade, but a gap nonetheless. She knelt, running her fingers over its cool surface. Her nail caught on something. A mark scratched into the stone near the edge, so faint it was almost invisible. She had to angle her head to catch it in the light from the high window. It was not a random scrape. It was deliberate. A letter H, and then another H intertwined. Henry Holloway, her great-grandfather's name, spoken by her mother in rare moments of reflection. He was the one who, according to family lore, had first come to this place. Jane felt a strange prickling sensation on her skin. It was just a scratch on a stone, she told herself. A mason's mark, perhaps. A coincidence. She tried to dismiss it, to return to her work, but the image of the intertwined letters remained burned in her mind. That evening, as dusk settled and she lit her candle, she found herself staring at the stone. Soot was curled upon it, his low purr a constant vibration in the quiet air. The old woman's words came back to her. Some roots go deeper than stone. She had thought it was a metaphor for family, for history. But what if it was literal? What if the secret of this place was not in the structure itself, but beneath it? The thought was absurd. She was tired, hungry, her mind playing tricks on her. And yet she could not shake the feeling that the stone, the mark, and the cat's strange insistence were all connected. A clue left behind by someone long ago, waiting for the right person to notice. The week Mr. Croft had given her was half over. Time was running out. The faint scratch on the stone was the first real question the barn had asked of her, and she knew with a certainty that defied all logic that she had to find the answer. The discovery of the marked stone shifted something inside Jane. It transformed her labor from a simple act of survival into a focused investigation. The barn was no longer just a dilapidated shelter. It was a puzzle box, and she suspected this single ill-fitting flagstone was the key. Her days took on a new urgency. Mr. Croft's one-week deadline loomed, a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. She had to know what, if anything, lay beneath that stone before he returned with his men. She began by clearing the entire northern section of the barn, sweeping away every last vestige of straw and dirt until the full expanse of the flagstone floor was revealed. The work was punishing. Her hands, soft from years of mending and needlework in the city, were now calloused and raw. The skin split at the knuckles. Every muscle in her back and shoulders screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain, driven by a strange, fierce hope. As she worked, she studied the floor, searching for other marks, other inconsistencies, but there were none. Only the one granite stone, a silent anomaly in the pattern of gray slate. With the area clear, she returned to it. She knelt and pushed on it with all her weight. It gave just a fraction of an inch, with a soft grinding sound. It was not set in mortar like the others. It was loose. A thrill, sharp and electric, shot through her. She tried to pry it up with her fingers, but the gap was too narrow. She needed a lever. Rummaging through the pile of rusted iron she had collected, she found an old bent crowbar. It was heavy and awkward, but it was the best tool she had. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the thin crack alongside the stone and leaned back, putting her entire body into the effort. The iron groaned. The stone refused to move. For a moment, she felt a wave of despair. Perhaps she was wrong. Perhaps it was just a loose stone, its significance imagined by her desperate mind. Soot, who had been watching her efforts from a safe distance, let out a soft meow, as if in encouragement. Jane took a deep breath repositioned the crowbar for better leverage, and tried again. This time, she felt a slight shift, a grating scrape of stone on stone. Ignoring the fire in her shoulders, she heaved again and then again. Slowly, painstakingly, the stone began to lift. A dark, earthy smell, the smell of a place that had not seen light in a lifetime, wafted up from the opening. With one final, desperate pull, the stone tilted upwards, heavy and cumbersome, and she managed to slide it aside. She peered into the darkness beneath. It was not a grave. It was a small, neatly excavated chamber, about 2 feet square, its sides lined with sheets of lead to keep out the damp. And nestled in the center of this hidden vault, resting on the dry earth, was a small, iron-bound chest. Jane stared, her breath catching in her throat. It was real, it was all real. The feeling, the cat's strange behavior, her great-grandfather's initials. It had all been leading her here. Her hands trembled as she reached into the hollow and grasped the chest. It was heavier than it looked, solid and dense. She lifted it out and set it carefully on the floor beside the opening. Soot came forward, sniffing cautiously at this strange object that had emerged from the earth. The chest was not locked. A simple iron hasp held the lid closed. With a heart hammering so loudly, she could hear it in her ears. Jane lifted the latch. The lid creaked open. The interior was packed tight. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover stamped with the same intertwined as the stone. Beneath it, she could see the coarse canvas of several small, heavy sacks, and tucked beside them a scroll of parchment, tied with a faded blue ribbon and sealed with a blob of dark red wax. She was almost afraid to touch it, as if the slightest contact might turn it all to dust, a figment of her imagination. With a trembling hand, she lifted out the heavy parchment scroll. The wax seal was brittle with age, but the insignia was still clear, the official stamp of the king's solicitor for the county of York. Her fingers fumbled with the ribbon, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. She unrolled the document. The script was archaic, a beautiful sloping copperplate, but the words were stark and unambiguous. It was a freehold deed of title, dated 1788. It stated, in language both plain and legally binding, that the parcel of land known as Holloway Croft, including 1 barn and ancillary structures, had been purchased in full by Mr. Henry Holloway, yeoman farmer, from the estate of the Earl of Danby for the sum of 200 gold sovereigns. The land was his, and by extension his heirs, forever. It was not rented. It was not leased. It was owned, utterly and completely. A sob, sharp and painful, escaped her lips. Her family were not tenants, they were landowners. And Mr. Croft was a liar. Jane sat on the cold stone floor, the deed spread across her lap, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew, the entire narrative of her family's decline and poverty, had been built on a lie. Her great-grandfather had not been a simple tenant. He had been a man of incredible foresight and thrift. She carefully lifted the ledger from the box. Opening it, she saw pages filled with his neat, precise script. It was a record of every penny he had ever earned and saved, a lifetime of toil distilled into columns of figures. He had worked for decades, saving to buy this small piece of England for his family, to give them a security he had never known. Then she turned to the canvas sacks. She untied the drawstring on the first one and tipped it out onto her blanket. A cascade of silver shillings and sixpences spilled out, tarnished but unmistakable. The second bag held more silver. The third, however, was heavier. She opened it and her breath caught. Gold. Dozens of heavy, gleaming gold sovereigns, their surfaces bearing the image of a long-dead king. It was a fortune. Not a vast one, but more money than she had ever imagined seeing in her life. It was the surplus, the money left over after Henry Holloway had paid for the land. A secret legacy, hidden from greedy landlords and the cruel turns of fate, waiting for a time when it would be needed most. She now understood her mother's last desperate words. Don't let them take it. She hadn't been talking about the barn itself, but what it protected. Her mother must have known, or at least suspected. But perhaps she never knew how to access it. Or perhaps she feared what a man like Croft would do if he discovered it. She had passed the key and the responsibility to Jane, her last act of faith. Jane had no time to celebrate her discovery, for the world outside the barn had begun to change. The pale autumn sky had darkened to a bruised purple gray. The wind, which had been a constant companion, now rose to a howl, rattling the loose shutter and tearing at the roof. A sudden violent gust slammed the great barn door shut, plunging the interior into near darkness. A moment later, the first flakes of snow began to fall, not gently, but driven almost horizontally by the wind. They hissed against the stone walls and found their way through the cracks in the roof, melting on the floor in dark, wet spots. A storm, a great and terrible storm, was blowing in from the moors. It was early in the season for such a blizzard, a freakish turn of weather that had caught the countryside unprepared. Jane quickly scrambled to put everything back. She replaced the ledger and the coins, leaving only the deed out, which she tucked safely inside her bodice. With immense effort, she slid the heavy granite stone back into place, covering the secret once more. She had found her family's truth, but now she had to survive to use it. The barn, her newfound fortress, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The wind shrieked, and the old timbers of the roof began to groan under the rapidly accumulating weight of the snow. The storm descended with a primal fury. Within an hour, the world outside the barn had dissolved into a churning vortex of white. The snow was a solid, blinding curtain, and the wind was a physical force, a battering ram that slammed against the stone walls. Jane huddled by her small, makeshift hearth, a circle of stones where she had built a tiny fire from the driest of the salvaged wood. The smoke, unable to escape through the snow-choked roof, stung her eyes and throat. But the small pocket of warmth was her only defense against the penetrating cold. Soot was pressed against her side, a trembling ball of fur. The sounds were terrifying. The barn, which had seemed so solid, now felt fragile, on the verge of collapse. The roof timbers creaked and groaned under a strain they were never meant to bear. A loud crack echoed through the space as a main rafter splintered, and a cascade of snow and splintered wood fell to the floor not 10 feet from where she sat. She was trapped. To go outside would be suicide. To stay was to risk being buried alive if the roof gave way completely. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, above the ceaseless roar of the wind, she heard a new sound, a desperate, rhythmic banging on the main door. At first, she thought it was the storm, a loose board or branch, but it came again, fainter this time, almost lost in the gale. A human sound. Someone was out there. Fear warred with compassion. Who could possibly be out in this? It could be a trick. It could be Croft's men. But the sound was too desperate, too raw. It was the sound of someone at the end of their hope. Taking her one candle, its flame fluttering wildly in the drafts, she made her way to the door. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the storm. A faint cry came back, whipped away by the wind. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the heavy iron bar she had found and wedged into place as a lock. The wind caught the door and tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the wall. A blast of snow and freezing air rushed in, extinguishing her candle and plunging her into darkness. Silhouetted against the swirling white were 3 figures, huddled together. A man, a woman holding a small bundle, and a child clinging to her skirts. "Help us," the man croaked, his voice hoarse with cold. "Our cart, broken axle on the road. We saw your light." They were travelers, their faces numb with cold, their clothes frozen stiff. The woman's bundle was a baby, wrapped in layers of thin blanket. Without a second's hesitation, Jane ushered them inside, fighting the wind to force the door shut and bar it again. "Come to the fire," she said, her voice shaking. She led them to her small hearth and threw more wood on the flames, coaxing them back to life. The family huddled as close to the fire as they could get, their bodies racked with shivering. The mother, whose name was Mary, unwrapped the baby, its small face blue with cold, and began rubbing its tiny limbs. Her husband, John, explained that they were headed for the next county, seeking work. Their young daughter, perhaps 5 years old, stared into the flames with wide, frightened eyes. Jane gave them her own blanket and the last of her dry wood. She shared the small portion of oats she had, boiling them with water from the well to make a thin, warm gruel. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. As they huddled together, another loud crack shuddered through the barn. John looked up at the groaning roof in terror. "It won't hold," he said. Jane looked at the spot where the rafter had splintered. The weight of the snow was bowing the roof dangerously inward. She remembered a pile of long, solid oak posts she had cleared from a collapsed stall. "Help me," she said to John. Together, in the flickering firelight, they dragged one of the heavy posts across the floor, and with immense effort managed to wedge it vertically beneath the sagging section, bracing it against the stone floor. They did the same with 2 more posts, creating a crude but support system. The groaning lessened. They had bought themselves time. Through that long, terrifying night, Jane did not think of the deed in her bodice or the gold beneath the floor. She thought only of the small family that had taken refuge in her home. She had become their steward, the keeper of their safety. In choosing to shelter them, to brace the roof not just for herself but for them, she had made a silent commitment. This barn was not just a possession, it was a sanctuary, and she would protect it. The storm raged for 2 full days. When it finally broke, the world was transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of snow covered everything, muffling all sound. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Inside the barn, the small family had survived. The child's cheeks were pink again, and the baby slept peacefully in its mother's arms. As the sun rose higher, casting a dazzling light through the high windows, John went to the door. We owe you our lives," he said to Jane, his voice thick with emotion. Mary simply clutched Jane's hand, her eyes filled with a gratitude too deep for words. John managed to repair his cart's axle, and by midday, they were ready to leave. Before they went, the little girl shyly handed Jane a small, smooth white stone she had been clutching, a simple, perfect gift. Days later, the snow had begun to melt, turning the lanes to impassable slush. The village was slowly coming back to life. Jane was outside, clearing a path to the well, when she saw 2 figures trudging up the track from the village. It was Mr. Croft, his face a mask of grim determination, followed by a large, brutish-looking man carrying a heavy axe. Croft's week of patience was over. "Right," he boomed as he approached, not even bothering with a greeting. "Time's up. I want you and your rubbish out of here. My man will start taking down the roof." Jane's heart began to pound, but she stood her ground, her hand instinctively going to the precious document hidden in her dress. "This is not your property, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Croft let out a bark of derisive laughter. "Is that so, and who's to say otherwise? You, a penniless vagrant?" He gestured to his man. "Start with the main beam." Just as the man lifted his axe, another sound reached them. The jingle of a harness and the crunch of wheels. A smart, black carriage was making its slow, difficult way up the muddy lane. It pulled to a halt, and a man in a dark, respectable coat and tall hat stepped out. He was followed by Thomas Fletcher, the young carter, whose face was tight with worry. "Mr. Croft," the gentleman said, his voice calm and authoritative, "I believe there is a matter of title to be settled here." It was Mr. Davies, a solicitor from York. Thomas, having heard Croft's boasts in the village pub about his plans for that day, had taken it upon himself to ride all the way to the city and fetch him. A small crowd of villagers, drawn by the commotion, had begun to gather at a respectful distance. In front of this impromptu audience, Mr. Davies turned to Jane. "Miss Holloway, I am told you have a claim to this property." With a steady hand, Jane pulled the deed from her bodice and handed it to him. Croft scoffed. A worthless forgery, no doubt. Mr. Davies ignored him, carefully unrolling the old parchment. He examined the script, the paper, and the brittle wax seal. He ran a practiced finger over the embossed stamp. The silence stretched, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Finally, the solicitor looked up, his expression neutral. He turned his gaze on Silas Croft. "This document," he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "is a genuine freehold deed, properly executed and sealed in the year 1788. It grants this land and all its structures to one Henry Holloway and his legal heirs. It is, I must say, utterly ironclad." He then looked at Jane. "As the direct and sole living descendant of Henry Holloway, this property, Miss Holloway, belongs to you." A collective gasp went through the watching villagers. Croft's face, which had been red with bluster, slowly turned a mottled, chalky white. He stood speechless, his authority evaporated, his lies exposed in the bright winter sun. The chorus of mockery that had followed Jane for weeks had finally, decisively, fallen silent. The aftermath of the solicitor's pronouncement was a quiet revolution in the village of Oakhaven. Mr. Croft, humbled and exposed, retreated into his house and was not seen for several days. When he did emerge, he was a diminished figure, his booming voice reduced to a resentful mutter. He never spoke to Jane again, but his gaze, when it happened to fall upon her, was a mixture of fury and grudging respect. The villagers, who had once been a chorus of whispers and mockery, now treated her with a kind of reverent curiosity. They had witnessed a pauper girl transform into a landowner before their very eyes. It was a story that would be told by their firesides for generations. The change was not just in their attitude, but in their actions. The blacksmith, who had once watched her with suspicion, appeared at the barn one morning with a set of mended hinges for the great door, refusing any payment. The shopkeeper's wife began setting aside a small measure of flour for her each week. Thomas Fletcher became a regular visitor, his cart arriving with loads of seasoned timber for repairing the roof or bringing news from the county town. He never spoke of his role in her vindication, but a quiet understanding grew between them, solid and dependable as the stone walls of her barn. With the security of the deed and the resources from the hidden chest, Jane began the real work of restoration. She did not hire a fleet of workmen or set about building a grand house. Instead, she continued the labor she had started, but now with a sense of joyful purpose rather than desperation. She worked alongside Thomas to repair the roof, learning how to lay slates and mix mortar. She replaced the rotten floorboards in the old hayloft, creating a small, clean sleeping chamber for herself. She glazed the windows, letting in the clear, bright light. The vast, cavernous space slowly transformed. It was no longer a ruin or a tomb, but a home, simple, sturdy, and filled with peace. She used a small portion of her great-grandfather's money to buy seed and a few hardy animals, a milking goat, and a flock of chickens that soon scratched happily in the yard. She planted a kitchen garden in the rich soil behind the barn, the very earth her ancestors had worked. The land, which had lain fallow for so long, began to live again under her patient hands. Outsiders started to arrive, not with mockery, but with business. A wool merchant from a distant town, hearing of the Holloway name being restored, came to inquire about the old grazing rights on the nearby fells, which the deed had also secured. Jane, with Mr. Davies's quiet counsel, negotiated a fair lease, bringing in a steady, respectable income. The barn was no longer just a home. It was the heart of a small, thriving enterprise, exactly as Henry Holloway must have dreamed. The community, seeing her quiet industry and fair dealings, began to see her not as an oddity but as an anchor, a fixed point of integrity in their world. The name Holloway, once a synonym for debt and failure, now stood for resilience and quiet strength. One soft spring evening, As the last of the golden hour light streamed through the open barn door, Jane stood looking out at the land she had brought back to life. The air was sweet with the smell of damp earth and new growth. The fields were greening, and the small orchard her great-grandfather had planted was covered in a cloud of delicate white blossoms. Thomas was there, helping her mend a section of the dry stone wall that marked her property line. He paused in his work, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "You've done a remarkable thing here, Jane," he said, his gaze sweeping over the tidy yard, the solid roof, the smoke curling gently from the new chimney. "To think what this place was when you arrived." He looked at her, his expression serious. "What will you do now with all this?" he asked, meaning the land, the money, the newfound status. Jane looked around her, at the warm light filling the space she had made her own. Soot was sleeping by the hearth, a picture of contentment. The small, smooth white stone given to her by the traveler's child sat on the mantelpiece, a reminder of the storm she had weathered. A deep sense of peace, an emotion she had not felt since she was a small girl, settled over her. She turned her gaze from the fields back to the sturdy oak beams and clean stone of her home. "It was never about the coin," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It was about the keeping of it." And in that simple truth lay the heart of her entire journey. The inheritance was not the gold, but the responsibility. Not the land, but the stewardship. Not the name, but the character required to honor it. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of Jane's story. It's a powerful reminder that true wealth is found in our character and our commitment to what has been entrusted to us. If this story of quiet triumph resonated with you, please consider leaving a like or a comment below. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories of hidden history and unexpected discoveries. We'll be back soon with another tale, just for you.